Have you ever looked at your parents and wondered if you were living with strangers? We were the picture-perfect suburban family. No secrets, no drama, or so I thought. But yesterday, I found a recording hidden in a box of old toys. It wasn't a home movie. It was a man begging for his life, and the voice laughing in the background belonged to my father, the most terrifying part. That man was convicted of a crime my father committed, and now he's out. The recording was just the beginning. I sat in my room, the silence of our middle-class neighborhood feeling heavier than ever. Then I heard it. A rhythmic tapping on the floorboards beneath my bed. It wasn't a ghost, it was code. 3 taps, then 4. I pulled back the rug and found a single silver coin tucked into a crack. It was a 1984 half-dollar, the exact year of the Fairwood heist, the case that made my father a hero and sent an innocent man to a cage. At dinner, I watched him. My father, the respected community leader, cutting his steak with clinical precision. I placed the silver coin on the table between us. The clink of metal on wood sounded like a gunshot. My mother froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. My father didn't blink, but his knuckles turned white around his knife. "Where did you find that?" he asked. His voice wasn't warm anymore. It was the voice from the recording. The voice that laughed. He didn't wait for an answer. He stood up and closed every curtain in the house, one by one. "We don't use high-tech security. We've never needed it. Tonight," he pushed the heavy dresser in front of the back door. "Go to your room," he whispered, "and don't open the door for anyone, not even me." As I climbed the stairs, I glanced at the window. A man was standing under the street lamp, perfectly still, wearing the same coat my father wore 20 years ago. I realized then that vengeance doesn't always come with a weapon. Sometimes it just comes to reclaim what was stolen. That man outside didn't want our money or our blood. He wanted our peace. He wanted us to feel the walls closing in, just like he did for 2 decades. I opened my father's old desk and found a letter that had never been mailed. It was an apology addressed to the prison. It was dated the day I was born. Our entire life was a bribe for silence. My mother didn't ask about the coin. She just started cleaning the table with a frantic energy, scrubbing at spots that weren't there. It was as if she were trying to wash away 20 years of comfortable silence. My father went to the basement and locked the door behind him. I stood in the hallway, listening. No heavy machinery, no high-tech sounds, just the slow, methodical scratching of a pen on paper. He was writing something, or perhaps he was rewriting history. I went to the front window. The man under the street lamp hadn't moved an inch. He didn't look like a threat. He looked like a monument. His presence was a silent accusation that made the walls of our safe neighborhood feel like they were leaning in. I realized then that psychological warfare doesn't need weapons. It just needs a witness who refuses to look away. He was waiting for my father to break, and the cracks were already starting to show. I slipped into the garage while the house was silent. Behind a stack of winter tires, I found a metal box I'd never seen. No digital codes, just a rusted padlock. I used a hammer to snap it. Inside were newspaper clippings from the Fairwood heist, but they weren't just the public reports. They were handwritten notes on the margins, detailing police movements that hadn't been released to the press. My father hadn't just found the stolen money. He had been the one to hide it. One clipping stood out. A photo of a man named Thomas being led away in handcuffs. He looked broken, his eyes wide with the confusion that the camera captured forever. He had been a clerk at the bank, a man with a family just like ours. My father had stood in court and pointed a finger at him, swearing he saw Thomas carrying the bags. Because of that lie, Thomas spent 20 years in a concrete box while we lived in this house. The guilt was practically vibrating off the paper. A soft thud came from the porch. I froze. I didn't call 911. Something told me the police wouldn't help us here, not when our life was built on their failure. I looked through the peephole. There was no one there, but a small, hand-carved wooden bird sat on the mat. My father had a matching one on his desk. He used to tell me he carved it in his youth, but the one on the porch was fresh. Someone was showing us that they knew our family's most private symbols. I decided to confront him. I walked to the basement door and knocked. No answer. I pushed it open. The room was cold, lit only by a single dim bulb. My father was sitting on the floor, surrounded by old bank ledgers. He wasn't crying. He was laughing, hollow, desperate sound. "He's not here for the money," he whispered without looking at me. "He's here for the time. He wants to see us lose the years he lost. He's already won, hasn't he?" The next morning, the neighborhood felt different. Our neighbors, the people we'd shared barbecues with for decades, were standing on their lawns, staring at our house. No one waved. No one smiled. It was as if a silent signal had gone out. They all knew. They had all been part of it. This wasn't just my father's secret. It was the foundation of our entire street. The perfect community was a syndicate of silence, and the man under the lamp was the one who had finally spoken. I tried to leave, but my car wouldn't start. Not a high-tech hack, just a removed spark plug. A simple, physical reminder that we weren't going anywhere. I walked to the edge of the driveway, but the man under the street lamp was gone. In his place was a small pile of gray ash. I realized then that he didn't need to stay. He had planted the seed of doubt, and now he was watching from the shadows as we tore ourselves apart from the inside. I found my mother in the kitchen, packing a suitcase. "We have to go," she said, her voice trembling. "Before the others find out we're talking." "Talking to who?" I asked. She pointed to the phone-an old landline. The cord had been cut. "He called," she whispered. "Thomas called." He didn't scream. He just asked if the house was as comfortable as he imagined it would be. He said he's coming to dinner tonight, and he expects a full apology. The psychological pressure was peaking. My father started setting the table for 4. He put out the fine china and the silver. He dressed in his best suit, looking like the hero the town thought he was, but his eyes were empty. We sat in total silence, the ticking of the grandfather clock sounding like a countdown. Every car that passed by made us flinch. We were waiting for a man who had every right to destroy us, and we had no defense but the truth. At exactly 7 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. Not loud, but firm. My father stood up, his legs shaking. He walked to the door and opened it. I expected a monster, a man fueled by rage, but standing there was an elderly man with a gentle face. He didn't have a weapon, he just had a small, worn notebook. "I don't want your house," he said softly. "I just want to read you the letters I wrote to my daughter that were never delivered because I was in your place." He sat at our table and began to read. He didn't talk about the heist or the money. He talked about the birthdays he missed, the smell of rain he'd forgotten, and the way his daughter's voice sounded before it faded from his memory. As he read, the perfect walls of our home seemed to crumble. My father wept openly, the weight of 20 years of deception finally breaking his spine. The vengeance wasn't pain. It was the forced realization of what he had taken. Thomas finished the notebook and closed it. He looked at me, then at my father. "You can keep the house," he said, "but you can't keep the lie. Tomorrow, we go to the courthouse. Not for a trial, but for a statement. You will tell them the truth, and I will finally be a father again." He stood up to leave, but he stopped at the door. "Integrity is the only thing you can't buy back once you sell it. I'm giving yours back to you. Don't waste it." The next day we didn't run, we walked. The neighbors watched from across the street, their faces filled with a mixture of fear and shame. My father spoke into the microphones, his voice clear for the first time in my life. He admitted everything: the heist, the framing, the 20 years of silence. The middle-class dream was over, but the nightmare was finally ending too. We lost everything: the house, the cars, the reputation. But as I watched my father shake Thomas's hand, I realized we had gained something far more valuable. We were no longer living in a beautiful cage of lies. True success isn't about the neighborhood you live in. It's about being able to look in the mirror without flinching. The past might come back for vengeance, but if you meet it with honesty, it can also bring you the only peace that actually matters. Thomas left as quietly as he had arrived, but the air he left behind was toxic. My father sat motionless at the head of the table, staring at the empty chair where a ghost had just sat. The fine china suddenly looked like stage props in a play that had been canceled. I realized that the elderly man didn't need to take our lives. He had already taken the one thing my father valued more than survival: his carefully crafted image of a good man. I stepped onto the porch to breathe, but the air felt thin. Every house on our street was dark, yet I knew they were watching. There were no crickets chirping, no distant sound of traffic, just a suffocating artificial silence. I looked at the pavement where the man had stood. There was a chalk mark there, now a simple circle. It wasn't high-tech surveillance. It was a psychological boundary. We were being quarantined by our own guilt. The landline rang. We all jumped. The cord had been cut earlier, or so I thought. I looked at the wall. The wire was severed, dangling like a dead vine. Yet the phone kept ringing. A steady, rhythmic chime that filled the hallway. My mother moved toward it like a sleepwalker. She picked up the receiver and held it to her ear. She didn't say a word. She just turned to us, her face as white as a sheet, and whispered, "He says the clock is still ticking." I couldn't take the mystery anymore. While my parents sat paralyzed in the kitchen, I went back to the attic. I began ripping up more floorboards, driven by a desperate need to know how deep the rot went. I found a leather-bound ledger hidden near the chimney. It wasn't my father's handwriting. It was a collection of signatures from everyone on the block. A pact of silence signed 20 years ago. Our entire neighborhood was built on a foundation of perjury. I heard a sound outside the attic window. I peered through the glass. Our neighbor from across the street was standing in his driveway, holding a flashlight. He wasn't looking for a lost pet. He pointed the beam directly at my face and held it there. It was a warning. If my father confessed, he wouldn't just be taking himself down. He would be dragging the whole perfect community into the light. We weren't just being haunted by the victim. We were being hunted by the accomplices. I went back down and confronted my father with the ledger. "You didn't just frame him," I shouted, my voice cracking. "You made everyone part of it." He looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "We were young," he whispered. "The bank had insurance. We thought it was a victimless crime. We used the money to build the school, the park, the library. We bought our way into being good people." I realized then that the most dangerous lies are the ones told for good reasons. The lights flickered and died. We sat in the sudden darkness, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the curtains. I heard footsteps on the roof, slow, deliberate thuds that moved from the chimney toward the front eaves. My father grabbed a heavy fireplace poker not to attack, but to hold onto something solid. "He's showing us," my father said. "He's showing us that walls don't matter when you've already let the truth inside." A heavy object hit the front door with a dull thud. We waited, hearts hammering against our ribs. When I finally worked up the courage to open it, there was a box. No high-tech gadgets, just an old-fashioned shoebox tied with kitchen twine. Inside was a stack of letters. They were the letters my father had received over the last 20 years, letters he thought he had destroyed. Thomas had been collecting them from the trash, from the post office, from everywhere. I started reading them out loud by candlelight. They weren't threats. They were descriptions of a life in a cell. Thomas had written about the color of the sky he couldn't see, the sound of his daughter's laugh he was beginning to forget, and the way the shame felt like a physical weight on his chest. Every word was a needle pricking at my father's conscience. The psychological torture wasn't coming from Thomas anymore. It was coming from the words my father had ignored. My mother couldn't take it. She stood up and began smashing the fine china against the floor. One plate, then another. The sound of porcelain shattering was the only thing louder than the silence of the night. "Give it back," she screamed at the walls. "Give him back his life so we can have ours." But you can't return 20 years. You can't unring a bell. The vengeance was the realization that some things are broken beyond repair. When the sun rose, a thick fog had rolled in, swallowing the street. I looked out the window and saw silhouettes in the mist. The neighbors were standing at the edge of our lawn. They weren't moving. They were just ... They knew the secret was leaking. The pressure to stay silent was being replaced by a much deadlier pressure to disappear. The back door creaked open. I turned, expecting a confrontation, but it was the neighbor's son, my childhood friend. He looked terrified. He handed me a key. "The garage at the end of the block," he whispered. "My father is planning to stop yours from going to the police. Take the old truck. It doesn't have the electronics they can mess with. Just go." For a second, I saw a flicker of hope. Not everyone wanted the lie to live forever. I showed the key to my father. This was our chance to run. We could pack a bag, leave the perfect life behind, and disappear into a new city with a new lie. My father looked at the key, then at the ledger, and then at the photo of Thomas. I saw the moment his soul finally righted itself. He handed the key back to me. "Running is what I did 20 years ago," he said. "Today, I'm going to stand still." He opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The neighbors moved closer, their faces obscured by the fog. They looked like a wall of shadows. One of them stepped forward, the man who had held the flashlight. "Think about your family," he hissed. My father looked at him and smiled sadly. "I am," he replied. "I'm finally showing them what a real man looks like." He began to walk down the driveway, one step at a time. The neighbors didn't use force. They used words. They shouted about the property values, the reputation of the school, the shame it would bring to the town. They tried to use the middle-class dream as a weapon to keep him in the cage. But my father kept walking. He didn't look back at the house. He didn't look at the cars. He looked straight ahead at the courthouse tower in the distance. The psychological hold they had over him was snapping with every stride. As my father reached the edge of our property, the neighbors didn't move. They simply stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a human wall. There was no shouting now, just a heavy, judging silence. It was a psychological standoff. They weren't using high-tech gadgets or weapons. They were using the weight of social exile. To pass them meant to leave the only world he had ever known. He hesitated, his foot hovering over the line where our lawn met the public sidewalk. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the back of the crowd. "Are you sure Thomas is who he says he is?" It was our oldest neighbor, a woman who had lived here since the houses were built. She held up an old newspaper. "Check the records again. Thomas had a brother." My heart skipped a beat. Was this another layer of the lie? In a psychological thriller, the truth is rarely a straight line. I looked at the ledger in my hand. Were we being played by the victim too? I ran back inside to the attic, my mind racing. I began cross-referencing the names in the ledger with the old neighborhood directory. If Thomas had a brother, where was he during the trial? And why did the handwriting in the ledger shift styles halfway through? The air in the attic felt colder. I realized that in a town built on a secret, everyone becomes a master of manipulation. I wasn't just investigating a crime. I was lost in a house of mirrors. I looked out the attic window again. The man who claimed to be Thomas was gone, but a small television sat on our lawn, powered by a long orange extension cord. It was an old tube TV, flickering with static. Then an image appeared. It was my father, 20 years younger, sitting in a dark room. He wasn't talking about the heist. He was talking to a man whose face was hidden in shadow. "We have to do it," my father said on the screen. For the family, the video wasn't a confession, it was an agreement. My father hadn't been forced into the lie, he had negotiated it. He had traded the life of an innocent man for the down payment on our house. The realization was a physical blow. The hero I grew up with was a ghost of my own imagination. I looked down at my hands and felt the weight of the silver coin. We weren't the victims of a haunting. We were the beneficiaries of a cold, calculated transaction. The neighbor with the flashlight walked up to our porch. He didn't come inside. He just tapped on the glass. "We all paid our price," he whispered through the wood. "We all kept the secret so our kids could go to the best schools. If you break the silence now, you're not just taking your father down. You're taking everyone's future." Is the truth worth the destruction of 50 families? The psychological trap was set. Truth or community? Honesty or safety? I went to the kitchen and looked at the fine china my mother had been smashing. Under the porcelain shards, I noticed something strange. The floorboards were slightly discolored. I grabbed a kitchen knife and pried one up. There was no money. Instead, there were dozens of letters, all unopened, all addressed to us from a prison in a different state. They weren't from Thomas. They were from the man my father had actually replaced. The plot was twisting again. If the man who came to dinner wasn't the victim, who was he? I ran to the front door and looked at the elderly man standing at the end of the driveway. He looked back at me and tilted his head. He wasn't a victim seeking justice. He was an architect seeking a collapse. He had spent 20 years studying our family from afar, waiting for the perfect moment to pull the thread that would unravel the entire street. He was the personification of a guilty conscience. I turned to find my mother standing behind me. She was holding a photo of the man from the lawn butt. In the photo, he was wearing a police uniform. "He was the lead investigator," she whispered. "He knew the truth the whole time. He helped your father frame the clerk." The revelation felt like the floor had dropped away. The man outside wasn't seeking redemption for a victim. He was seeking a partner to go down with him before he died. The psychological game was clear now. The investigator didn't want the truth to set us free. He wanted the truth to destroy us all at once. He had waited until he had nothing left to lose to bring the whole neighborhood to its knees. He was the wolf in sheep's clothing, and my father was his favorite target. I realized that the only way to win a game this crooked was to stop playing by their rules. I had to find my own way out. I grabbed the ledger and the letters. I didn't go to the front door. I went to the basement. I remembered a small crawl space near the furnace. If my father had been keeping records, there had to be a final entry, the one that explained why they did it. I crawled into the dark, the smell of dust and old paper filling my lungs. My fingers brushed against a cold metal box. Not a high-tech safe, just a simple lockbox with my name on it. I opened the box. Inside was a single key and a map of the local woods. No money, no jewels. Just a note in my father's handwriting, for when the silence becomes too loud. He had known this day would come. He had built a life on a lie, but he had left me the tools to dismantle it. He wanted me to be the one to end the cycle. The psychological burden shifted from his shoulders to mine. I was the keeper of the family's soul. I slipped out the back window, avoiding the neighbors and the man at the street lamp. The fog was so thick I could barely see my own hands. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. I followed the map toward the old creek. This was where the heist money was supposed to be hidden, but I knew better. My father didn't hide wealth there. He hid the one thing that could actually prove the clerk's innocence: the original, unedited security tapes. I reached the old oak tree marked on the map. I dug into the soft earth until my shovel hit something hard. It was a weather-proofed canister. Inside were the tape's physical evidence that couldn't be hacked or deleted. I held them to my chest, feeling the weight of 20 years of stolen time. This wasn't just a story about a crime anymore. It was about the physical proof of a man's life. The vengeance was finally within my reach. I stood in the woods, looking back at the lights of our perfect neighborhood. I could go back and burn the tapes, keeping the house and the comfort. Or I could walk to the station and end the golden era of Oak Ridge forever. I thought about the man in the cell, and I thought about the man under the street lamp. One wanted justice, the other wanted chaos. But I just wanted to be able to sleep again. I took the first step toward the truth. I walked out of the woods with the canister clutched to my chest. The fog had started to lift, but the air felt colder, sharper. I wasn't the same person who had entered those trees. I was a carrier of a truth that would act like an explosive in our quiet cul-de-sac. I could see the glow of the street lamps in the distance, but they didn't look like beacons of safety anymore. They looked like spotlights on a stage where the final act was about to begin. As I approached our street, I saw that the neighbors hadn't gone home. They were sitting on their porch steps, watching the road. It was a middle-class version of a blockade. They didn't have weapons, but they had their presence a collective, suffocating weight. He didn't say a word, but his eyes tracked the canister in my hands. The psychological pressure was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. I didn't sneak in the back this time. I walked straight up the driveway. Mr. Henderson stepped into my path. "Think about what you're doing," he said, his voice low and raspy. "If you open that canister, you aren't just hurting your father. You're destroying the value of every house on this block. You're taking away our retirements." I looked at him and realized that for some people, a bank account is more valuable than a man's soul. I pushed past him and entered the house. The living room was dark, except for the flickering light of the fireplace. My father, Thomas, was sitting in his armchair, staring at the embers. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. I set the canister on the coffee table. The sound of metal hitting would echoed through the house. "It's over," I said. "I found the tapes. I know you didn't just watch. You let it." He didn't deny it. He just closed his eyes. "The bank didn't lose that money," he whispered. "The community did. We took it to build the park, the pool, the things that made this place perfect. We convinced ourselves we were Robin Hoods." I looked around at our comfortable furniture and the family photos. Everything was bought with the years Arthur spent in a cell. We weren't a family. We were a crime scene. The psychological weight of the room was unbearable. My mother, Diane, came down the stairs. She wasn't wearing her usual pearls. She was wearing an old raincoat, clutching a small bag of essentials. "I can't stay in this house another night," she said, her voice trembling. "Every time the floorboards creak, I hear Arthur's footsteps. Every time the wind whistles, I hear his voice." She wasn't running from the law. She was running from the ghost of her own complicity. The landline chimed that same rhythmic, impossible ring. I answered it this time. There was no static, no heavy breathing, just the sound of a clock ticking. Then, Arthur's voice. "The courthouse closes at noon tomorrow," he said. "I've waited 20 years. I can wait 14 more hours, but your neighbors won't." He hung up. He wasn't just threatening us, he was warning us. The neighborhood was about to protect its secret at any cost. I looked out the window and saw 3 cars pull up in front of our house. Men got out, men my father had played cards with for 2 decades. They walked onto our lawn and stood in a semicircle. They didn't have masks or torches. They were wearing sweaters and khakis. This was the most terrifying part of the psychological thriller. The villains looked exactly like us. They were the good people defending a lie. There was a knock at the door, not Arthur, but Mr. Henderson. My father opened it. "Thomas," Henderson said, "we've talked. We're willing to help you. We can make the canister disappear. We can say you found it and it was empty. We can keep the dream alive. He held out a hand. It was a final invitation to stay in the cage. My father looked at the hand, then at me, then at the canister. The silence lasted an eternity. My father took a deep breath and did something I will never forget. He didn't take Henderson's hand. He took the canister. "The dream died 20 years ago," Thomas said. "We've just been living in the corpse." He slammed the door in Henderson's face and locked it. The shouting started, then muffled, angry voices from the lawn. They weren't just neighbors anymore. They were a mob in polo shirts. We were officially under siege. We retreated to the basement. My father began packing the old bank ledgers into a bag. "They won't let us drive out the front," he said. "But the old storm drain at the edge of the property leads to the creek. It's tight, it's dirty, but it's the only way to the courthouse without being seen." He wasn't acting like a criminal now. He was acting like a man trying to save his son's future. The hero was finally showing up, but in the ruins. We opened the heavy iron grate in the floor of the utility room. The smell of damp earth and old concrete rose up to meet us. My mother went first, then me, then my father. As we crawled through the darkness, I could hear the neighbors walking on the floorboards above us. They had entered the house. They were looking for the tapes, looking for us. We were beneath our own life, literally crawling through the muck to reach the truth. The tunnel felt like it was closing in. It was a physical manifestation of the psychological pressure we'd been under for years. Every few feet, my father would stop to listen to the vibrations above. Finally, we saw a glimmer of moonlight. We emerged at the creek, covered in silt and shivering. The neighborhood was behind us, a cluster of glowing windows that looked like a fortress of secrets. We were out, but we weren't safe yet. We walked through the woods toward town. We didn't use flashlights. We used the stars. My father carried the canister like it was a holy relic. I realized that vengeance had completed its cycle. Arthur didn't have to do anything. The truth itself was the weapon. It had driven us out of our home, stripped us of our status, and sent us into the cold. But for the first time in my life, I didn't feel afraid of the dark. The sun began to peek over the horizon as we reached the town square. The courthouse stood there, gray and imposing, and sitting on the bottom step, wrapped in a thin coat, was Arthur. He didn't look triumphant. He just looked tired. He stood up as we approached. My father stopped 3 feet away from him. No words were spoken. Thomas simply held out the canister. The exchange was a silent confession that outweighed 1,000 screams. Arthur took the canister. His fingers brushed against my father's. A brief contact between the man who had everything and the man who had nothing. There were no cameras, no high-tech recordings, just the cold morning air and the weight of 20 years passing between them. My father bowed his head, not in defeat, but in a strange kind of relief. The secret was no longer his to carry. The haunting of our middle-class life had finally reached its end. Behind us, the sound of car engines filled the quiet streets. The neighbors had found our trail. 3 SUVs pulled up to the courthouse curb, their headlights cutting through the dawn mist. Mr. Henderson stepped out, looking disheveled, his perfect neighbor, mask slipping. He looked at Arthur, then at the canister, then at us. He realized the wall of silence had been breached. The psychological hold he had over the block was evaporating with the morning sun. Henderson didn't shout. He spoke in a voice that was terrifyingly calm. "You realize what happens now, Thomas? The lawsuits, the foreclosures. The kids won't be able to show their faces in this town." My father looked at me, then back at Henderson. "They'll show their faces," my father said, his voice stronger than I'd ever heard it, "because for the first time, they won't have to hide who they are. We're trading our houses for our souls. It's a bargain." The heavy oak doors of the courthouse groaned open. A lone security guard peered out, confused by the small crowd gathered in the cold. Arthur walked up the steps first, followed by my father. I stood on the sidewalk, watching them go. It was a scene from a past that refused to stay buried, finally walking into the light. The neighbors stayed by their cars, trapped in their own fear. They were still prisoners of the lie, while we were finally becoming free. We sat in the sterile hallway of the district attorney's office. No high-tech monitors, just flickering fluorescent lights and the smell of stale coffee. Diane held my hand, her grip firm for the first time in days. We weren't a golden family anymore. We were just three people in rumpled clothes waiting to tell the truth. The suspense wasn't about what would happen to us, it was about who we would become once the words were spoken. Inside the office, the tapes began to play. The grainy, black and white footage showed the truth in all its cold, unedited glory. There was the heist, and there was my father, directing the scene. As the DA watched, the room felt smaller. Every frame was a nail in the coffin of our old life. But as the truth filled the room, the psychological weight that had been crushing my chest for years started to lift. The past was no longer a ghost. It was just a story. The news didn't stay in that room. Within an hour, the town's quiet surface began to crack. Phones in the hallway started ringing. Reporters began to gather outside. The Silver Creek case was being reopened, but this time, the evidence was undeniable. It wasn't just about my father anymore. It was about the system that allowed it to happen. The vengeance Arthur sought wasn't a fire that burned everything. It was a light that showed where the rot was. We didn't go back to the house. We couldn't. It was a crime scene now, a monument to a life we no longer owned. We checked into a small, nondescript motel on the edge of town. No fine china, no silk curtains. Just 2 double beds and a television that only caught 3 channels. My father sat by the window, watching the cars go by. "I haven't felt this peaceful since the day before that heist," he whispered. Honesty was the best sleep aid he'd ever found. The next morning, the headlines were brutal. My father's face was on every front page. Labeled as a suburban fraud, the neighbors we had known for years gave interviews, painting themselves as victims of his deception, trying to distance themselves from the ledger I had found. It was a final psychological twist, the community turning on its own to save itself. But I knew the names in that ledger. I knew they weren't victims. They were just cowards. A week later, an envelope arrived at our motel. It wasn't heavy or bloodstained. Inside was a simple note from Arthur. It said, "The truth didn't give me my 20 years back. Nothing can. But seeing you stand on those steps gave me something I thought I'd lost. A reason to believe in people again. It wasn't a thank you, but it was an acknowledgement. Our sacrifice was the only way to heal the wound my father had opened." The bank moved in on our house. The cars were sold. The golden retriever went to live with my aunt. One by one, the symbols of our middle-class success were stripped away. I watched as the moving truck took the furniture my father had bought with stolen time. It should have been devastating, but as each piece left, the house felt less like a prison. We were becoming lighter. We were losing the world, but we were gaining ourselves. My father took a job at a local warehouse, moving crates for minimum wage. My mother started working at a library. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment above a bakery. Every morning the smell of fresh bread filled our home, a real, honest smell. We didn't have high-tech security anymore. We didn't even lock the door during the day. Why would we? We had nothing left to steal and no secrets left to protect. I caught my father looking in the bathroom mirror one morning. He was older, his hair grayer, and his hands were calloused from the warehouse. But his eyes were clear. The shadows that had lived in them since I was a child were gone. He looked like a man who could finally handle his own reflection. That's when I realized the vengeance had been a gift. Arthur hadn't destroyed us. He had dismantled the lie that was destroying us. The Oak Ridge neighborhood never recovered. Without the lie to bind them, the families started to move away. The perfect street became just another street. Some followed my father's lead and confessed their part. Others fled to new towns to start new lives, but the cycle in our family was broken. I looked at the silver coin I still kept in my pocket. It wasn't a reminder of a crime anymore. It was a reminder of the price of integrity. I realized that a psychological thriller doesn't have to end in a scream. It can end in a breath. We were no longer defined by what we owned, but by what we said. As I walked to my own job that afternoon, I saw Arthur sitting on a park bench, watching the children play. He caught my eye and nodded. It wasn't a nod of friendship, but of shared truth. We were both survivors of the same storm, and we were both finally on dry land. Our life now is small. There are no expansive lawns or gated driveways. Our living room is lit by a lamp with a cracked shade, not a crystal chandelier. But for the first time, the air in our home doesn't feel heavy. We don't speak in whispers anymore. When the floorboards creak, we know it's just the wood settling, not the weight of a man we wronged. We traded the golden life for a real one, and it's the best bargain we ever made. My father, Thomas, did one more thing before the trial. He wrote a letter to the local paper. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just asked the town to stop looking for perfection and start looking for honesty. He wrote about how a middle-class dream can become a nightmare if it's built on someone else's nightmare. The letter didn't make him popular, but it made people think. It was the first pebble in a landslide of change. Slowly, the silence in Oak Ridge began to fail. Other children from the neighborhood started asking their parents questions. Why do we have that extra account? Why did we move here in 1984? The psychological armor of the community was cracking. One by one, small truths began to surface. It wasn't a violent revolution. It was a quiet awakening. My father's confession had given everyone else permission to be human again. I walked past our old house one last time. It was boarded up, a for sale sign leaning crookedly in the yard. It looked smaller than I remembered. It wasn't a palace. It was just a box where we had stored our fear. I realized then that vengeance isn't about hurting someone. It's about taking away the mask they use to hide. Arthur didn't want my father to suffer. He wanted him to be seen. And now, my father was finally visible. One evening, a woman knocked on our apartment door. It was Caleb, the neighbor's son who had given me the key. He didn't look like the confident kid I grew up with. He looked lost. "My father won't speak to me because I helped you," he said. I invited him in. We sat at our small kitchen table, and I realized that the truth often separates us from the people we love, but only if that love was built on a lie. I showed Caleb the silver coin. "This used to be a symbol of a crime," I told him. "Now it's a symbol of a choice." We talked for hours about the weight of expectations and the fear of falling behind in the middle-class race. We were the next generation, and we were deciding right then that the cycle of silence stopped with us. We wouldn't inherit our parents' shadows. We would build our own light. The day of the hearing arrived. It wasn't a high-tech media circus. It was a quiet room with a judge who looked like he'd seen too many lies in his career. My father stood up, refused a lawyer, and pleaded guilty to everything. He looked at Arthur, who was sitting in the front row. There was no anger in Arthur's eyes anymore. There was only a profound, weary peace. The case was finally, truly, closed. The judge handed down a sentence of community service and full restitution. My father would spend the rest of his life paying back the money he had borrowed from the truth. It was a long road ahead, but as we walked out of the courtroom, my father's step was light. He wasn't a hero, and he wasn't a villain anymore. He was just a man making things right. And in this world, that is the rarest thing of all. Arthur met us at the courthouse steps. He didn't have a notebook or a canister. He just had 2 tickets to a baseball game. He handed one to my father. "My daughter is meeting me there," Arthur said. "She wants to know who the man was that finally told the truth." They didn't embrace, but they walked toward the parking lot together. Two men who had lost 20 years, finally finding a way to live in the present. I sat on a bench and watched them go. I realized that most people are terrified of the past coming back. We spend our lives running, building walls, and buying things to keep the ghosts at bay. But the ghosts aren't there to haunt us. They're there to wake us up. Vengeance is just a mirror held up by someone we hurt, forcing us to see the person we've become. When you stop running, the ghost disappears. You don't need high-tech gadgets or a massive platform to change the world. You just need one honest word spoken at the right time. My father's perfect life was destroyed, but his soul was saved. I looked at the people walking by, all of them carrying their own little secrets and middle-class anxieties. I wanted to tell them all, it's okay to let go. The truth won't kill you. It will only kill the person you're pretending to be. Tonight, I'm sitting in our small apartment. Diane is reading by the lamp, and Thomas is asleep in the other room. There are no rhythmic tappings under the floor, no mysterious phone calls, and no shadows under the street lamps. The silence is finally just silence. It's a beautiful, quiet thing that you can only appreciate when you've earned it. We are poor in money, but we are billionaires in peace. So, I have to ask you, what are you carrying? What secret are you protecting to keep your perfect life intact? We all have an Oak Ridge in our hearts. We all have a Thomas we're pretending to be and an Arthur we're trying to ignore. But the longer you wait, the heavier the debt becomes. Vengeance doesn't have to be a tragedy. It can be the alarm clock that finally saves your life. True strength isn't found in never falling. It's found in the courage to admit you are wrong while everyone else is telling you to stay silent. It's found in the willingness to lose everything to gain your integrity. My father lost a house, but he gained a son who finally respects him. He lost a reputation, but he gained a conscience. That is the only success that actually survives the night. Our story doesn't end with a happily ever after in a mansion. It ends with a hard-earned once upon a time in a small apartment. But we are excited for tomorrow. We are excited to work, to grow, and to live without looking over our shoulders. The past came back for vengeance, but it ended up giving us a future built on a foundation that no storm can shake, because there are no cracks of lies left in it. If you feel like your past is catching up to you, don't run. Turn around, face it, give back what you took. Say the words you've been hiding. It will be the hardest thing you ever do, and it might break your heart, but it will also set you free. You are not your mistakes. You are the person who decides what to do after the mistake. That is where your power lies. That is where your story truly begins. I hope our story reminds you that it's never too late. No matter how deep the secret or how long the lie, the truth is always waiting to welcome you back. You don't need a middle-class dream to be happy. You just need a clear conscience and a heart that doesn't have to hide. You are capable of redemption. You are capable of change. You are capable of building a life that is actually worth living. This was the story of the Miller family, but it could be the story of anyone. We explore these psychological depths because the greatest thrillers aren't happening on a screen, they're happening inside us. Every choice we make is a plot twist. Every secret we keep is a cliffhanger. And every truth we tell is a resolution. Thank you for walking through the fog with me today. I hope you found your way to the light. There are many more stories to tell. Stories of shadows that turn into guides, and secrets that turn into strengths. If you enjoyed this journey into the human psyche, stay with us. We dive deep into the mysteries of the heart and the thrill of the truth every week. Subscribe and turn on the bell, because you never know when the next story might be the one that mirrors your own life. You are not alone in the dark. Until next time, remember, the most suspenseful journey you will ever take is the one that leads to the truth. Sleep well, live honestly, and don't be afraid when the past comes knocking. It might just be bringing you the key to your freedom. This has been The Debt of Silence. I'm glad you listened. Now, go out and live a story you're proud to tell.